So tonight I maybe partially inspired by the current um, American election season, have chosen to call our session tonight "Politics Before Peace: Chanukkah Election Season in the First Century." I, I think I think this is going to turn into I think this is going to turn into a session over the next few weeks, which I don't mind it doing, meaning a series actually that it'll turn into, because I really want to lay the foundations of the political nature and vibe of what was going on at the time in the first century. Of course, we are interested in the first century because of Jesus' birth and coming in the flesh in the first century. So the thing is, though, is we want to get to a fuller perspective. There's obviously Hanukkah, which is important. I've said it for years. I believe Christians should be doing it, but the question is why? And the question gets bigger than that because it obviously flows also into the issue of how does what happened with Hanukkah speak to or affect what's happening in the first century that Jesus is born into? I think these things are desperately important, and there's so many angles on why it's important. So I would like to see if we can pull something of value out of that. I'm very intrigued to see how tonight will go with the kind of content I want to share and the way that it's going to be shared in. So let's see. My intention isn't personally to talk a whole lot. I imagine again that we'll get into rigorous discussion and elaboration on what's on here. That's the hope with this. So I'm gonna, yeah, I I don't need to say a lot. I think there's just gonna come so much out of this in the little bit that I'm trying to take. But again, as we've seen in the past, we tend to end up talking a lot. Even when I say that I don't want to talk too much, we do end up going into a lot of discussion on what's on what we get into here. So let's see what what's going to happen here if we dive right in now. Okay, so think the gospel is simple. Let's get the bigger picture. I have said in the past, and I'll probably have to say it a lot of times into the future too, that I don't believe the gospel is simply Jesus dying on the cross and rising again, although that's obviously a huge part of it. I don't believe that it just focuses on the idea of mankind, us, confessing sin to Jesus and getting eternal salvation through him. Although, again, that's obviously part of it. We've already looked a few weeks back on the idea of the cosmic nature of this, that there's a bigger war going on. We are now the pendulum swinging to the other side. We're not going to focus on the supernatural nature with supernatural warfare, with the celestial beings, the fallen ones, all of that. The pendulum's now to the other side, that we've gone past, like effectively past the focus of the cross too, which we're not saying doesn't appear and isn't there. I've already said that now. Now we go to a way more micro view. And what I think this micro view is going to do for you is give you an appreciation of the participants, of the situation, of the mood, of the social, political, religious, I can say it, mess that was in the first century. And this is not to assume the mess was only in the first century. I think the mess has been on all these levels, has been the mess in the whole of mankind's existence since the fall, in fact. But the idea is that getting a session done like tonight, hopefully, and you'll be able to tell me this by the time I'm done, is to give you a better appreciation of angles on the first century that you're not going to traditionally find in a Christian setting. Um, you might be surprised to find that tonight we're going to talk very little about Jesus actually tonight, which sounds odd to say, but we really are going to talk a little bit of very little about him. Um, because in order to get to show you the bigger picture with Jesus, and we will over the course of these few weeks look more specifically at the birth narratives and stuff like that. But once we've done this, and maybe another session, depending on how much we get done now, another session following the same model before we focus fully on Jesus is what's going to make you go, oh, okay, good heavens. Now this makes sense. That makes sense. It's kind of building up the situation around Jesus, let's say that. It's building up the context into which Jesus is born again, as I said. So that's the idea here. Please note, you are not going to remember everything we're going to say here tonight. It is going to sound overwhelming. It's going to make your head spin. Do not try and remember everything because you won't. You will have to go back and check this again. And that's kind of the point that I want to make just in itself. There is probably forests that could be wiped out with the writings of all of the context, all of the angles and the outflow from what I've tried so hard just to kind of summarize in angles we're going to look at. But you're going to quickly see how just complex this is. Um, so please enjoy the experience, but don't expect to understand everything instantaneously. It can take a lot of work, and maybe it'll inspire some personal study for you. If it does that, fantastic. So you're looking here at a beautiful diagram, which I didn't construct on my own. I wanted to make something like this, and then thank God I found something like what I wanted to do, and it's it's a great tool to work with. So part of what I want to do is obviously if we're talking Hanukkah, we're talking about the Maccabees and more specifically the Hasmonean dynasty. Now the Hasmonean dynasty would be the king priest lineage that is from the tribe of Levi through the story of Mattathias and Judas Maccabee being the hammer. And what happens from that time? Um, Sorry, let me just see here now. I've got to. Sorry, guys, I've just got to get out of here, which it's struggling to let me do. Okay, so to a large extent, we're going to look at Herod tonight, and not just Herod, of course. We're going to dip into the Hasmoneans. Remember, Hasmoneans links to the Maccabees. That is the story of the Maccabees, and remember that Maccabees, of course, relates to Hanukkah. So we're going to be kind of taking quick looks back to that side, and we're going to look a little bit beyond that into the first century, of course, as well. It's going to be little patchwork of things, but the point is you're going to get you're going to get the political climate, the political story, the history, all of that, all of which, again, as I say, is meant to speak to what's going on in the first century. And it is huge. As I said, we can't possibly do it complete justice. There's so many stories, so many sub stories, subplots, so much intrigue in all of the stuff that we're going to get into. We can't honestly deal with it all. So I've just handpicked some of the stuff. So let's get started here. Now, a lot of this is going to sound familiar, of course, to you. And you'll see this diagram has been bullet point. It's got numbering, so we're going to try and follow that numbering with very simple summaries. This is taken from the Bible Archaeology Review. They were kind enough to make something like this available. So I've used their slides and I'm using their summarized commentary, but we can obviously add to it if we want, and you can jump in. I know people like Nande specifically and Gary would have a lot to say in a session like this because of the political story. So please, or anyone else for that matter, I know Janet too, when she joins us, would loves the political story. Jump in when you want to, and let's see what we get out of this. So we start number one there with Herod the Great. He's the governor of Galilee and he's the king of Jews. The dates don't matter that much to me. The point right now is that he's the one who tries to kill Jesus. So this is where the story starts. Um, So he starts the Herodian dynasty, which is obviously named after him, the dynasty of Herod. Um, and this is the guy that tries to kill Jesus. This is the one who also institutes the slaughter of the innocents at Bethlehem. Now, the thing is, this is the part that obviously is well known in Christianity because it forms the story of the slaughter of the innocents, at least, obviously forms a substantial part of the nativity story, and there's nothing wrong with it because it's a true thing. But of course, the story is more broader than that, and that's what we're looking at. We're looking at behind the scenes, looking at what's going on, what influences the gospel writers, what's going on around that they're dropping hints at, or when I say hints, it's not really hints. They're taking for granted that their audience knows the stuff because their audience lived through it. And that's why we need to know it. So let's see what we can get going with that. And we move on to the next point, yeah? So, point number 2, Herod Philip. Now, if you look at this, if you're seeing it already, you should be able to see it. That this diagram, for those that are just listening online, of course, I'll have to try and explain if you're just getting the audio, not the visuals. The diagram starts, of course, with Herod at the top. We've said he tries to kill Jesus. Then we basically building up his family tree. Um, Now, Herod has a couple of wives. We're not obviously interested in all of the wives to their fullest extent and who and what they are, and we're not going to pay equal attention to all of them. But he has a number of wives. There's 10, at least 10 wives that Herod ends up going through over the course of his lifetime. Now, point number 2, we're moving into looking at Herod Philip. Now, Herod Philip is obviously Herod's child. Um, and he becomes the first husband of Herodias. Um, and he wasn't a ruler. Now, the reason why Herodias is important, that's going to become clear when you start seeing that Herodias becomes famous for something relating to John the Baptist. And you're going to start seeing the point of what you're going to start seeing is this is so intricately intertwined that it is a head scratcher. And that's an important thing to get because if it was this complex and convoluted and confusing in the first century, that's part of the story. That's literally part of the chaos that's going on during this time. And it's important to know that. So keep Herodias in mind because yeah, she's going to come up again. In fact, she comes up right away. The next point is we know that Herodias leaves Herod Philip. So Herodias is married to Herod Philip and then marries, now just try and stick with this, the half brother Herod Antipas, which is the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. So this is where the trouble starts because John the Baptist is obviously going to get involved in the story, and this is where John will eventually lose his head. So there's a lot of political maneuvering in relationships and obviously romantic situations that probably shouldn't have happened. Um, then we look at Salome, which is a great grandchild of Herod. So Herodias was a grandchild of Herod, but Herodias ends up marrying two of her uncles effectively. As weird as that is, she marries two of her uncles. Obviously, the second one is Herod Antipas that she ends up with, and that's the time of John's rebuke situation. Now, watch this. Salome is the one who ends up dancing for Herod Antipas. Okay, so John the Baptist rebukes Antipas. Why? Because he marries Herodias, which was his brother's wife, while the brother was still alive, and that's against the law of Moses. Salome, or Salome, however you want to say it, Salome probably, danced for Herod Antipas, and at Herodias's direction, that's her mother now, requests the beheading of John the Baptist. She ends up later marrying her uncle Philip. Now, if that's not confusing and sounds like a soapy on TV, then I don't know what does. And remember, all of this, you must understand too that a lot of this stuff is all about political maneuvering and political issues that's going on. Next, we move. Yeah, okay. So we've already spoken about Herod Antipas, but here's the other thing we can say. After Solomon's dance and his rash promise, he executed John the Baptist. And watch, here's the important and interesting part to show you how this is all interlinked. Later, he's part of Jesus' trial too. So the same guy that's, I remember this is now, of course, the children, we're talking about the children of Herod, and they obviously get given different positions of power, tetrarch, within the Roman Empire. He'll show up later as part of Jesus' trial. So this means it's a it's the child, one of the kids of Herod the Great. Now remember, don't confuse Herod the Great with the one who's part of the trial, because that's then one of his children, and the child that's now married to the brother's wife. So as we say, we're really keeping it in the family there. Then we turn to Herod Archelaus. He's an ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, which is where Herod comes from, effectively through his family. Um, and he gets replaced by a series of Roman governors, including Pontius Pilate. So Herod was never fully in charge himself, of course. He plays the game well, he plays the political game, and that's what we're going to follow to some extent. And eventually, Pontius Pilate will take the position that he ends up holding too, because these power, these positions of power shift all the time in the story in the first century. In fact, the only thing that is certain is uncertainty. Bribery, corruption, murder, assassination attempts. It's there's too. Let me say this to you. There's even just too many to even keep count of. That's the crazy part of what Jesus was, the situation he was born into. Okay, then we get Philip the Tetrarch. He was at the Northern Territories. He later obviously marries Herodias' daughter Salome, which is his grandniece. So that's that's quite crazy. And obviously, I would say that that's probably part of the tradition that Herod put into his family to keep things in the family in that way. Then we go to the next one, point number 9. We're just following the bullet points here, the numbered points. King Herod Agrippa, he's the one that executes James, the son of Zebedee, and imprisons Peter before his miraculous escape. So what you can see here is you've got from Herod the Great, obviously Herod dies around about the time just after Jesus' birth. That allows Jesus to come back home. But between the children and the grandchildren of Herod, with their varied amounts of power, there's a lot of interaction in the gospel story and what follows on. And this is the important thing, is to show that these political maneuverings were directly leaking or seeping into the gospel narrative and directly affecting the lives of the apostles, the rabbis, in terms of the story of what we follow and what we believe to be the gospel. So Herod Agrippa the first is the one that imprisons Peter and executes James, the son of Zebedee. Then we've got another character here that is the great grandchild of Herod, and Bernice gets widowed twice, and her third husband, she leaves the third husband to be with Agrippa the second, and was with him at Festus's trial of Paul. So now you got another one of the offspring that ends up directly connected to the story of the gospel and the players in the gospel. King Herod Agrippa II is appointed by Festus to hear Paul's defense. So that's again, obviously, Bernice sitting with him in that situation. Then we got, again, people mentioned in the book of Acts, I want to say, yeah, if I'm not mistaken. You got um, the Antonius Felix and Drusilla, which is mentioned in scripture. So between all of that, and again, it's highly convoluted. Even if I offered you R1,000,000 and asked you to even just put 5 or 6 of those points in place, and we didn't even talk about the dates of the leadership, because that would just confuse the situation even more to try and remember those dates. Here's the point: Herod's dynasty is leaking into, it's overlapping with the gospel, with the story of Jesus in ways that do matter. Now, maybe you're still thinking, but okay, you mentioned some names, and you might still be trying to wrap your head around, okay, which one was the child, which one was the grandchild, which one left, married this uncle, and then moved in over here with that one, and did. And you got to understand that all of those maneuverings, all of those things that were happening, were done for political reasons. Very underhanded, very shallow, lacking credibility and character. All of this was what completely um, defines the political maneuverings of the day. And the irony of this is, we're looking kind of at the story of Chanukkah, and the irony of that is that's what ended up happening with the Hasmoneans. The Hasmonean story is one of incredible corruption eventually. So let's talk about what kickstarted the story of Hanukkah, the events that leads to Hanukkah. It was a dedication. It was the idea of purifying. It was keeping things as it should be. And at the start of the process, this was good. It was right. But over the course of the Hasmoneans, that now being the sons and the grandkids and the great grandkids moving on, pretty much the same way we've just looked at Herod. It runs from Mattathias to his son Judas Maccabee and John Hyrcanus, and it goes all the way, all the sons, there's a whole lot moving down. And as we go down, it just gets more corrupt and more insane. And that becomes important too, because the whole political play is so corrupt. It's actually depressing when you really look at it in its fullness. It's actually quite sad. You wonder if there's hope for humanity. And why I'm saying again, this is important to note. Jesus wasn't born into a simplified first century life where not much was going on. Your biggest problem was whether or not your cow was going to give enough milk for the next few days, or where do you have enough wheat to make, or barley to make bread. It was highly complex. It was intense chaos. It was corruption everywhere you looked. It was a huge mess. And maybe as we move on, you'll get a bit of a better appreciation for just how messed up it was. I said we'll look at Herod's political play, although we're going to focus a little bit on Herod, yeah. So let's look at Hasmoneans to Herod, because that's the kind of connection I want to show you, yeah. Now, here is a quote again from one of the authors for the Biblical Archaeology Review, sorry. So Jason Schlude, if I'm saying his name right, I hope. Here's what he says about Herod. To come to a full appreciation of Herod the Great, that's now the main man that is in power as Jesus is born, we must understand him as more than a one-dimensional Roman frontman. He actively and aggressively manipulated the complex imperial circumstances of his day to secure position of authority for himself. In the process, the friend of the Romans also became the friend of the Parthians. Even if the friendship appears short-lived, after more than a century of intense scholarly scrutiny, there remains much more to learn about Herod. So, in other words, what this is telling us is that Herod is not, and I like that he says it, um, Herod is not a one-dimensional character. I like that. I like that statement about him, because he definitely isn't. So let me just quickly let someone else into the meeting. While we're at this point, just because we can, any thoughts so far? Any thoughts on what, on that very complex and strange story of Herod's family? Is,
A lot of incest going on there.
you're right, John. That's not even the worst of it.
Because I'm just looking at the diagram of Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, and he's got, so the picture of Bernice and Agrippa II, they're all brothers and sisters, are you saying? So they're all brothers and sisters marrying each other?
Yeah, it's a big mess.
Mm.
It's and again, I'm telling you, that isn't even the end of the story. That's not even the worst of what
Mm.
ends up happening between. Now, I just wondered to myself, you know, and this is pure speculation. I haven't researched this officially, but I'm asking myself the question, looking at all of that and asking, does Herod fancy himself and his family, since he's taken from the Hasmonean story, and I'm going to get more into the how Herod links to the Hasmoneans, which is, remember, always remember, Hasmoneans are Levites, and in Levitical history and in Levitical law, they, as crazy as it sounds, like mild incest is actually how it gets done. I'm being very hyper technical now, because cousins could marry a lot closer than you would expect should be allowed. And that happens in the Levitical culture because of the need to keep the line pure. And I'm just asking the question, and it is a stretch, and it's just a speculation. Is Herod in his head fancying himself like kind of a proto Levitical Hasmonean, moving into creating my own Hasmonean culture? Is that part of why he promoted this idea? Was he the instigator of it? And again, like I said, this is speculation, but it might just explain some of this very strange family activity within Herod's family tree. But like I say, that is pure speculation. I can't say that I've found evidence that tells me that. Okay, so I want to, yeah, anyway, before I do that, any other thoughts? John, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I sort of, I've had a little bit of a read into some of that period between of the 400 years of not much being said in the Word of God, and yeah, I've been reading about the amount of corruption that has been going on in between, and just it was interesting to find out how that kingship from Herod actually, yeah, did come out from the Maccabee, or is it Judas Maccabee?
Right, from the
Yeah, I was
Asmodeans.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was, from something that was, that we honor and celebrate. There was a lot of corruption that came out of that, and it's just, yeah, it's amazing, the history. I mean, that I was just touching the edges of it, but you're going a bit deeper, which is interesting. Yeah.
No, it's a mess. Like I say, it's actually, if you looked into it deep enough, you'd put your hands on your head and you'd say, what was Jesus born into? Which is a good thing, I think, because that's the point here. To
Yeah. Yeah.
appreciate that the magnitude of the chaos going on will explain a lot more of why we needed the Messiah and why we still need him. And then, of course, there's the offshoot to look into what went wrong with the Asmoneans, what went wrong with the Maccabees. And there's
So,
lessons.
Darren,
Yes.
I was Herod ethnically Jewish?
Oh, that's a good question. No. The part of the story of how he becomes quote unquote Jewish is, and this is part of the problem, is that in the decaying process of the Hasmonean dynasty, they started, ironically, this is the irony, they started doing the very thing that caused the initial ancestors to start the story of Chanukkah, which is that you can't force someone to change at the tip of a sword.